There's a table in front of you with 11 months of your life sitting on it, and you are about to pick it up and throw it in the trash, and the 9 people watching you do it are going to think correctly that you have lost your mind. The product is finished. That's the part that matters. That's the part that makes this insane instead of merely difficult. It works. It's beautiful, or close enough to it that every single reasonable person standing in this room would ship it tomorrow morning and sleep like a baby. The launch is in 6 weeks. The money is spent, and most of it was borrowed, and some of it was borrowed against things a person should not borrow against. And you are standing there holding the thing in your hands, turning it slowly over, and you have found a seam. A hairline gap where 2 pieces of the housing meet, about the width of a human hair, on the bottom of the device, in a place that a customer will never look at, will never notice, and could not possibly care less about if they somehow, through some act of God, did happen to notice it. And you say very quietly, no. And your lead engineer, a man named Marcus, who has not slept properly in about a year, who has a wife and 2 kids and a mortgage, who has personally defended you in rooms where serious people called you a lunatic to his face, looks at you and says, Ken, nobody will ever see that. And he's right. He is completely, factually, unarguably, provably right. Nobody will ever see it. Not one human being ever, for as long as that product exists on this earth, will see that seam. And you say, they'll feel it. And you set the thing back down on the table. And you tell 9 exhausted people who have given you a year of their one life, that we are doing the housing again. 11 months of work, 6 weeks to launch, over a seam that nobody will ever, ever see. That is without question the worst thing you will ever do to a group of people who trusted you. And it is also, precisely and exactly, the reason that 4 years later, a stranger in a country you've never visited will open a box with your product inside it and go quiet for a second, and not know why, and put their hand on the thing the way you touch something that feels like it was made specifically for you, by someone who cared. This whole video is about that. About the strange, expensive space between a seam nobody sees and a feeling everybody has, and about what it actually costs, in real money and in real people, to live your life inside that space. So let's go back to the beginning, which, as always, is so much stupider than the legend. You did not set out to build a company. You wanted to fix an annoyance. That is the actual, literal origin of the whole thing, and I need you to really hear how unimpressive that is. There was a category of device that everybody on Earth used every single day, and everybody quietly, permanently hated. Not dramatically. Nobody was writing letters about it. It was that low-grade background, unexamined irritation that you feel toward a thing that is technically fine and secretly awful. Everyone had simply made peace with it. The buttons were in the wrong places for the human hand. It took 9 separate steps to do the one thing that 90% of people bought it to do. It came in a box with a 400-page manual, and not one single person alive, in the entire history of that product category, had ever read past page 6. And the entire industry looked at that fact and treated it as normal, instead of treating it as a confession. And you looked at that same thing and you had a thought that wasn't brilliant. It was just stubborn, and the thought was, it doesn't have to be like this. Somebody just decided it would be like this, a very long time ago, probably for a reason that stopped being true 2 decades back, and then everybody quietly agreed to stop noticing. So you built a version that didn't have the 9 steps. And the way you got there is the entire secret of everything that follows, so let me say it as plainly as I possibly can. You did not add anything. You removed. You took the thing that everyone else in the industry was making and you started deleting. You deleted features. You deleted buttons. You deleted options and choices and settings and entire capabilities that the salespeople swore on their lives, were absolutely essential and could not be removed. Every single competitor was locked in an arms race to add more functions, longer spec sheets, bigger numbers printed on the side of the box, because the box is where the war was being fought, and you went in the exact opposite direction, completely alone, and you just kept deleting and deleting until the object could only do a small number of things, but it did those things so perfectly that a person could use it without ever once having to think about it. That is the entire craft. That's it. That's the whole thing. Everyone believes the genius is in what you put in. It is not. The genius, the actually scarce and difficult thing, is in what you have the nerve to leave out. because every single thing you add makes the object worse in a way that is completely invisible on a spec sheet and absolutely enormous in a human being's hands. Addition is easy. Anybody can add. A committee can add. Subtraction requires taste. And taste requires saying no. And no is the single most expensive word in the English language. And I am going to spend the rest of this video showing you precisely what it costs. The first prototype was built in a garage. Obviously, they all are. And it was, I have to be honest with you, genuinely ugly. The insides were exactly right, and the outside was an embarrassment, and that is where you learned the first hard lesson of your entire career, which is that people do not experience your engineering. They never will. They experience the surface. They experience the sound the thing makes when it clicks shut. They experience whether it feels heavy in the way that says quality, or heavy in the way that says we used cheap parts and didn't care. All that gorgeous, elegant work you did on the inside that you're so proud of that took you months, the customer will never see one single atom of it. And that doesn't matter. And pretending that it should matter is just your ego doing the talking. The object is a promise you're making to a stranger, and the surface is where the promise actually gets made. Nobody would fund it. Of course they wouldn't. You walked into rooms full of investors and you carefully explained that your device did fewer things than the competition and cost more money. And then you watched them politely wait for the punchline that wasn't coming. Understand the position you were in. In an industry that sold entirely on spec sheets, you were pitching a smaller number at a higher price. And the only thing you had to explain why anyone would want that was a feeling that you could not put on a slide. You'd say, it's just better. And they'd say, better how, specifically? And you'd say, here, hold it. And they would look at you the exact way they'd look at a man who had just asked them to smell a painting. So you funded it the way that every single one of these things actually gets funded, which is badly, personally, and with money you did not have. You put in yours. All of it. And Marcus, your lead engineer, the man from the seam story, he put in some of his. Which is a fact you will think about a great deal later, at 3 a.m, for years. And you hired 7 people who were, without exception, wildly overqualified and dramatically underpaid, and who were there for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with money, which is the only kind of person who can build something like this. And you all worked together in a space that was too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter, and you built the first real one. And it was, if I'm being completely honest, a modest success, not a phenomenon, not a revolution. Nobody wrote a book about it. It was a modest, promising, genuinely real success. It sold to a relatively small number of people who cared a very great deal. And those people were evangelical about it in a way that honestly startled you. They didn't just like it. They told other people about it. They defended it in arguments at parties. Somebody wrote you a letter, an actual physical letter, on paper, with a stamp, to say thank you, about a piece of consumer electronics. And you read that letter 4 times and you never told a single person how much it affected you. And that was the moment you finally understood what you had actually built. And it wasn't a device. What you had built was a small, portable piece of evidence that somebody, somewhere, cared. That is what people were responding to. It was never the specs. It was the care. Because in a world that is absolutely saturated, drowning in objects that were designed by committees to hit price points, you had made a thing where every single decision, every one, had been agonized over by an actual person. And human beings can feel that. They can feel it instantly, and they can't name it, and they will never be able to explain it to you. You cannot fake it. It leaks out of the object. That is the entire business. That's the only business. And then the rival came. And the rival matters, because the rival is where most of the pain in this story actually lives. They were much bigger than you. They copied the shape of your idea, badly, but very, very quickly. They sold it for significantly less money. They put more features on it, because of course they did. And their spec sheet was, by every single measurable standard that anyone could point to, superior to yours. And they beat you. Not everywhere and not forever, but in that season they beat you badly. And you had to sit in a conference room and look at a chart that showed a company with objectively worse taste and objectively better distribution eating your lunch while you watched. And that's where you learned the second hard thing, the one that the inspirational posters leave out. Being right does not automatically win, not on any schedule that you get to choose. Taste is a very long game. Distribution is a very short one. And if you run out of money on a Tuesday, then your beautiful taste is nothing but an extremely expensive tombstone. Anybody who confidently tells you that quality always wins in the end has conveniently skipped over the part where the end is 9 years away and payroll is on Friday, so you nearly died. And the near death was boring and mathematical, the way they always are. You had 6 weeks of cash in the bank, and a product that was genuinely better than the market's alternative, in a market that had not yet noticed and was under no obligation to. And so you did the thing. You personally guaranteed a loan against everything you owned, which is a sentence people say very lightly, and which means, in actual practice, that if this fails, you have nothing, and everyone who loves you has nothing, and their lives are worse forever because of a decision they didn't get a vote on. And you did it anyway, and you made payroll, and you kept all 7 of them, and you shipped again, and here is what actually saved you. And it wasn't a genius move. It was just a refusal to become them, because there was an obvious move sitting right there on the table, and every single person, including people who loved you and wanted you to succeed, told you to make it. Add the features, match their spec sheet, cut the price by cheapening the parts that nobody sees anyway, win the argument on their terms, on their battlefield, and you looked at that road, honestly, seriously, for longer than you'd like to admit, because a man with 6 weeks of cash considers absolutely everything. And what you understood standing there was that at the end of that road, you would be a slightly worse version of a company you did not respect. And there is no market position on earth more instantly fatal than being a slightly worse version of somebody else. So you did the exact opposite. You got smaller. You cut the product line from 6 things down to 2 things, which meant killing work you loved and telling people whose projects were good, genuinely good, that their year was going in a drawer. And then you took every dollar you saved by doing that, and you poured all of it into making those 2 remaining things unreasonable. Not better. Unreasonable. You spent real money on the inside of the box, which no one photographs. You spent 4 weeks on the sound the lid made when it closed. You chased seams that nobody would ever see. In the single worst financial moment in the history of your company, you doubled down on caring, which every spreadsheet in the building correctly identified as insane. And it was insane. And it also worked. Because the only real moat you had, the only one, was that you were willing to be crazier about the details than any competitor with a sane budget and a board of directors could ever possibly justify being. Which brings us all the way back around to the seam, and the room, and the 9 exhausted people. Because you have to understand what that no actually was. It wasn't perfectionism. Perfectionism is a psychiatric condition. This was a strategy. Although I'll admit, if we're being honest here, that it was probably also a little bit the condition. But the seam was never about the seam. The seam was about the fact that the very moment you ship one single thing that you know is wrong, you have taught every person in that building that the standard is negotiable. And a standard that is negotiable isn't a standard at all. It's a preference. And you cannot build a company whose only actual asset is carrying on a foundation made of preferences. So the seam had to die. Not because the customer would see it, because the team would know that you let it go. Every single person in that room would carry that permission with them into every decision they made for the rest of their careers, and the whole thing would rot from the inside out, invisibly, starting that day. But I'm not going to let myself off the hook that easily, because that explanation is far too clean, and it's exactly the kind of thing a founder says in an interview afterward. And this video is supposed to be about the parts that nobody tells you. So here's the real cost. And it isn't the money. The money came back. The cost is that a life built entirely on the word no makes you extraordinarily difficult to love. Because you cannot be a person who says no to a seam that nobody on earth can see, and then go home and be a relaxed and easygoing person about anything else. That is not how any of this works. It isn't a switch you flip in the parking lot. You are the exact same person at the dinner table that you are at that table with the 11 months sitting on it. And the people at the dinner table did not sign up for a man who has strong opinions about the way the plates are stacked in the cabinet. They just wanted dinner. And Marcus. Marcus, who said, nobody will ever see that. He was right about the seam, and he was also, quietly, underneath the sentence, telling you something completely different, and you did not hear it. What he was actually saying was, I have given you a year of my life, and my kid's year, and I would like just once for it to be enough. And you said no. And you were right. And he left 8 months later. And he was right too. And both of those things are completely true at the same time. And nobody Nobody prepares you for a world in which you can be entirely correct and still lose someone permanently. And there were others. There is always a list. There are the relationships that quietly ended without a fight. Because you were never actually in the room, you were always in the object. There are the friends who slowly stopped calling because he's busy gradually became he doesn't care. And the genuinely terrible thing, the thing you can't argue your way out of, is that they were half right. Because caring in a human being goes somewhere. It's not infinite. It's not a renewable resource. And you spent yours on seams. Every single unit of obsession that went into that object came out of somewhere. And where it came out of was the people who loved you. They paid, in full, for a product they never asked for. And the world thanked you for it, and never once thanked them. That is the thing that nobody tells you. Everyone tells you it costs hard work. Hard work is nothing. Hard work is the easy part. Hard work is genuinely fun. That's why you do it. What it actually costs is that you slowly become a person who is beautifully optimized for objects and catastrophically unoptimized for people. The very same instinct that makes the thing perfect makes you a difficult partner, a distracted friend, a boss who is loved and feared in a ratio that shifts week to week, depending on how close you are to shipping. And the world will never, ever see that part. The world only sees the box. So let's talk about the box. Because 4 years after the seam, you finally get the moment. You're standing at the back of a room, and there's a person there who has absolutely no idea who you are, and they are opening one of your products for the first time. And you watch them do the thing. They lift the lid, and it doesn't fall. It descends. With that specific, engineered, dampened slowness that took your team 4 months and cost more money than it had any earthly business costing. And their face changes. Just slightly. Almost nothing. And they don't know why. They will never know why. There is not one single conscious thought in that person's head about damping coefficients or tolerances or the 11 months or the seam. They simply feel in some wordless place beneath language that this object was made by somebody who genuinely cared whether they liked it. And that feeling is so unbelievably rare in modern life that when it lands on a person, it lands like being seen. And that's it. That's the whole thing. That's what every bit of it was for. Not the market cap. That's just a byproduct. That's the exhaust. The actual point was that unrepeatable half second on a stranger's face. And here's the last thing nobody tells you. And it's the one I'd put on the wall if I could only keep one. The world will remember the object. It will never, not once, ever remember the 10,000 no's. Every single no that made that lid descend the way it descends is permanently, structurally invisible. Nobody will ever thank you for the features you deleted. Nobody will write an article about the 6 products you killed in order to make 2 great ones. Nobody will ever know about the seam. Ever. That's the entire point of it. The seam's success is that it doesn't exist. Your whole life's work is a mountain of invisible refusals, and the only thing that anyone will ever see is the one small, perfect object sitting on the very top of it. And they will call it magic. And they will assume that it was easy, that it just fell out of your head that way. And they will assume you're a genius, when in fact you were mostly just a person who was willing to be hated on a Tuesday by people you respected over a hairline gap. So if you want to go build the next one, then build it. God knows this world has more than enough objects made by committees to hit price points, and nowhere near enough evidence lying around that anybody ever cared about anything. But understand what you're actually signing. You are signing up to spend your entire life saying no. You are signing up to be the villain in the story of good people who worked hard and did nothing wrong. You are signing up to be difficult to love in exchange for being easy to admire, which is the worst trait available to a human being in every single way except the one way that matters to you, which is the half second on the stranger's face. You are signing up to build a mountain of invisible decisions and then stand on top of it, alone, holding a thing that appears to every single person who sees it, to have simply arrived in the world fully formed. Nobody will ever see the seam. That was always entirely the point. And you will always know that it isn't there. Now go make something. And when every person in the room tells you that nobody will notice, believe them. They're right. They're completely right. Do it anyway.